Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Eastern Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The hills of Harlan County, Kentucky hold many secrets. Some are whispered about on front porches when the evening cools. Others remain locked away in courthouse basements or in the memories of those who've long since passed. But perhaps none has cast such a long shadow as what locals came to call the incident at Widow's Creek, the disappearance of the Blackwood sisters in the autumn of 1940. Three women, known throughout the region for their distinctive home-brewed spirits, vanished without a trace from their family homestead, nestled deep in the hollows of the Cumberland Mountains. For decades, their disappearance remained nothing more than local legend, a cautionary tale told to keep young women from wandering too far into the woods alone. The official record stated simply, "Missing, presumed deceased." But in 1967, a discovery in the county archives would challenge everything the community thought it knew about that fateful autumn night. What follows is the account of not just their disappearance, but the systematic erasure of their existence from official records, and the quiet conspiracy that kept the truth buried for nearly 3 decades. The Blackwood property sat on roughly 20 acres of densely wooded land, approximately 7 miles from the nearest town of Cumberland. The narrow dirt road leading to their cabin was often impassable during the rainy season, leaving the sisters isolated for weeks at a time. This isolation suited them, according to post office records from 1939, which noted that Martha Blackwood, the eldest sister, would collect mail for all 3 women only once per month. Their homestead consisted of a main cabin, a small outbuilding used for distilling, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house. The property bordered Widow's Creek to the west, which local mining operations had begun to pollute in the late 1930s. The sisters drew their water from a natural spring on the eastern edge of their property, according to county water rights documents filed in 1928. The Blackwood sisters, Martha, Eleanor, and Ruth, were the last of their family line. Their parents had passed during the influenza epidemic of 1918, leaving Martha, then 22, to raise her younger siblings. The daughters inherited not just the family homestead, but also their father's closely guarded recipes for corn liquor and fruit brandies. In the years that followed, the Blackwood name became synonymous with quality moonshine, even during the harshest years of Prohibition. By 1940, Martha was 44, Eleanor 40, and Ruth 36. None had married. According to tax records from 1937-1940, their modest income came officially from selling preserves and herbal remedies in the Cumberland General Store. Of course, locals knew their actual livelihood came from their distilling operation, which had continued to thrive even after Prohibition's end, as their spirits were considered superior to legal alternatives. Sheriff's Department logs from the period make no mention of any raids or investigations into the Blackwood operation, despite the well-known nature of their business. This unusual oversight would later become a critical piece of the puzzle. The last confirmed sighting of the sisters was recorded on September 17, 1940, when Eleanor and Ruth made their monthly trip to Cumberland for supplies. The store ledger, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, lists their purchases: 50 pounds of sugar, 20 pounds of cornmeal, coffee, salt, and several yards of muslin cloth. The store owner, Joseph Miller, would later tell authorities that nothing seemed unusual about the women that day. They were, in his words, quiet as always, paid in cash, and left before noon. The sisters' disappearance might not have been noticed for weeks had it not been for a delivery attempted by Wilson Coal Company on September 28th. According to a statement given to the Cumberland Gazette, delivery man Thomas Jenkins found the cabin apparently abandoned when he arrived with the sisters' winter coal order. The front door stood ajar, A pot of stew had spoiled on the stove, and 3 cups of tea sat untouched on the kitchen table. Their truck was parked in its usual spot beside the outbuilding. Jenkins reported the strange scene to Sheriff Robert Holcomb upon returning to town. The official report, filed on September 29, 1940, notes that Holcomb and 2 deputies visited the property that afternoon but found no signs of struggle or foul play. The case was classified as a voluntary departure, and little further investigation occurred. This cursory examination would prove to be either a stunning example of professional incompetence or something far more sinister. For most of Cumberland, life continued. The war in Europe dominated newspaper headlines, and the disappearance of 3 reclusive women eventually faded from conversation. By the winter of 1940, the Blackwood property stood empty, its buildings gradually surrendering to the elements. County records show that in March of 1941, the property was claimed for unpaid taxes by Harlan County, then sold at auction to Hollister Mining Corporation for a sum well below market value. Within months, mining operations began on the former Blackwood land, with a new access road cut through the property that significantly shortened the route between the Hollister mine and the county road. What remains most striking about the official response to the sisters' disappearance is what's missing from the record. No photographs of the scene were taken, no inventory of the cabin's contents was recorded, no interviews with neighboring properties appear in the sheriff's logs. The investigation, such as it was, appears to have been concluded within 24 hours of Jenkins's report. For 27 years, the case of the Blackwood sisters remained closed, their memory gradually fading like the worn inscriptions on the family headstones in Cumberland Cemetery, where their parents lay buried. No markers were ever placed for the sisters themselves. Then came the summer of 1967, when graduate student Margaret Palmer arrived in Harlan County to research Appalachian folk traditions for her doctoral thesis at the University of Kentucky. While examining county archives for documentation of traditional herbal remedies, Palmer discovered a sealed file mistakenly placed among medical records from the 1940s. The file, marked simply Blackwood, 1940, contained photographs and handwritten notes that directly contradicted the official account of the sisters' disappearance. Palmer's discovery would eventually lead to a reopening of the case, though by then many of those involved had either died or left the region. What follows is the account reconstructed from those documents and subsequent investigation. The file contained 14 photographs taken inside and around the Blackwood cabin, apparently on September 29, 1940, the same day Sheriff Holcomb officially visited the property. These images show a scene markedly different from the one described in his report. The kitchen was in disarray, with one chair overturned and what appeared to be dark stains on the floorboards near the hearth. Outside, 3 sets of footprints led from the cabin toward the creek, where they were joined by several other trails before continuing into the woods beyond the property line. Most disturbing were the personal effects documented in the photographs but never mentioned in official reports. 3 hairbrushes laid out in a row on a bedroom dresser, each with hair deliberately removed and missing. A family Bible with the Blackwood genealogy page torn out, and a partially burned letter in the fireplace, only fragments of which remained legible. The handwritten notes accompanying these photographs were initialed M.D., later identified as Dr. Michael Donovan, the county medical examiner, in 1940. His notes included observations about the stains, consistent with blood approximately 36 to 48 hours old, and the footprints, at least 2 additional individuals, larger boot prints, likely male. The existence of these documents raised an alarming question. Why were these findings excluded from the official record, and who had sealed them away, separate from the case file, where they remained hidden for nearly 3 decades? When Palmer brought these documents to the attention of authorities in 1967, the current sheriff, William Denton, reluctantly agreed to re-examine the case. His initial skepticism gave way to concern as more inconsistencies emerged during his investigation. The teacups mentioned in the original report were sent for analysis, revealing traces of a powerful sedative commonly prescribed for insomnia in the 1940s. The stain patterns on the floor, still faintly visible beneath layers of dust in the abandoned cabin, matched those in Donovan's photographs and were confirmed to be human blood. Most significantly, Denton discovered that the original witness, Thomas Jenkins, had died in a hunting accident just 6 weeks after reporting the sisters missing. His death had been ruled accidental, but the circumstances, found at the bottom of a ravine with a single gunshot wound, suddenly seemed suspect. As Denton dug deeper, he uncovered a pattern of connections that suggested the sisters' disappearance was far from a mystery to certain people in Cumberland. Sheriff Holcomb, who had conducted the original investigation, resigned his position unexpectedly in early 1941 and relocated to Louisville. County records showed he purchased a substantial home there in cash, despite his modest sheriff's salary. Joseph Davis, who had been president of Hollister Mining in 1940, was also president of Cumberland Bank and served on the county commission that approved the sale of the Blackwood property after its tax seizure. His signature appears on multiple documents expediting the transfer of ownership. Dr. Donovan, whose suppressed report might have launched a proper investigation, was found to have received a significant loan from Cumberland Bank in October 1940 to expand his medical practice. The loan was approved personally by Davis, according to bank records, and was later forgiven entirely in 1945. These connections form the outline of what appeared to be a coordinated effort to acquire the Blackwood property, an effort that may have turned deadly when the sisters refused to sell. The Blackwood sisters were not merely moonshiners, though that was the public face of their operation. County agricultural records from 1936 indicate they maintained extensive herb gardens, growing plants not common to the region. According to several elderly residents interviewed by Palmer in 1967, Martha Blackwood in particular was known as a healing woman or granny doctor, someone with extensive knowledge of traditional medicine who served those who couldn't afford or access conventional medical care. This aspect of their reputation had been carefully documented by Palmer, who noted that several pharmaceutical companies had sent representatives to Appalachia in the 1930s seeking traditional remedies that might be developed into commercial medicines. According to correspondence found in the university archives, Martha had been approached twice by such representatives, but had refused to share her family's medicinal recipes. This refusal paralleled their resistance to selling their land, suggesting a pattern of protecting family knowledge and heritage against outside commercial interests. It also provided yet another potential motive for those who might have wanted the sisters removed. The most revealing evidence came from an unexpected source. In May of 1968, responding to newspaper coverage of the reopened investigation, retired miner Samuel Abernathy came forward with information he had kept secret for 28 years. Abernathy had worked for Hollister Mining from 1938 until 1952. In his sworn statement to Sheriff Denton, he claimed that in the summer of 1940, several months before the sisters disappeared, he had been part of a geological survey team sent to examine the Blackwood property. The survey, conducted without the sisters' knowledge or permission, had identified a substantial coal seam running directly beneath their land. According to Abernathy, Joseph Davis had repeatedly attempted to purchase the property from the sisters throughout 1939 and 1940. Martha Blackwood, who held the deed, refused each offer. Abernathy recalled overhearing a conversation in which Davis told mine supervisor Richard Holt that those stubborn women are sitting on a fortune and they don't even know it. Something will have to be done. Abernathy claimed that in late September 1940, he and 3 other miners were ordered to accompany Holt to the Blackwood property after dark. They were told it was to deliver an improved offer, but Holt carried no paperwork, only a small case that Abernathy never saw opened. The men waited at the edge of the property while Holt approached the cabin alone. Abernathy stated that he heard raised voices, then silence. After approximately 30 minutes, Holt returned and instructed the men to clean up inside the cabin. Abernathy described entering to find the three sisters apparently unconscious. The men were directed to carry the women to a company truck parked on the logging road behind the property. Abernathy assumed the women had been drugged, but believed Holt's explanation that they were being transported to the county hospital following an accident. It wasn't until the next morning when he overheard Holt telling Davis that the Blackwood problem has been permanently resolved, that Abernathy began to suspect something far more sinister had occurred. When the sisters were reported missing days later and no investigation followed, his suspicions deepened. Abernathy claimed he had remained silent out of fear for his own safety and that of his family. Several workers who had been present that night had later died in mine accidents under questionable circumstances. Only after leaving the region in 1952 did he feel safe, and even then, he came forward only after most of those involved had passed away. Davis had died in 1961, Holt in a mine collapse in 1954, and Sheriff Holcomb of a heart attack in 1960. Palmer's investigation also uncovered another disturbing pattern. Between 1935 and 1950, tax records showed at least 17 properties in Harlan County had followed a similar trajectory: refusal to sell to mining interests, followed by the owner's unexplained departure, tax seizure, and sale to mining companies at reduced prices. In most of these cases, the properties shared a geographic characteristic. They sat atop or adjacent to viable coal seams. Many of the former owners had simply vanished, while others had reportedly left the region suddenly, abandoning belongings and sometimes even livestock. One such case involved the Thornton family, whose farm bordered Blackwood property to the north. According to a brief mention in the Cumberland Gazette dated July 12, 1938, James Thornton, his wife Mabel, and her sister Lorraine Ellis departed the region unexpectedly after selling their property to Hollister Mining. Neighbors reported that the family had adamantly refused previous offers, then suddenly changed their minds and left without farewells. No forwarding address was recorded for the Thorntons. No subsequent records of them appear in neighboring counties. Like the Blackwood sisters, they seemed to have vanished completely, but because a sale had been recorded, however suspicious the circumstances, no questions were asked. The Thornton property was never searched during Denton's reinvestigation, as mining operations had dramatically altered the landscape in the intervening years. Whether their fate mirrored that of the Blackwood sisters remains unknown. With Abernathy's testimony, Sheriff Denton had enough evidence to warrant a search of the abandoned mine shafts on what had once been Blackwood property. Hollister had ceased operations there in 1959 when the coal seam was exhausted, and the entrances had been partially sealed, as required by regulations at that time. On June 12, 1968, a search team entered the primary shaft. Approximately 400 yards in a side tunnel that had been marked as unstable on mining maps, they discovered human remains. The tunnel had been deliberately collapsed, concealing what appeared to be 3 sets of female remains. Forensic examination was limited by the technology of the time and the condition of the remains, but analysis confirmed they were consistent with women of the sisters' ages and heights. Personal effects found with the remains: a silver locket containing a photograph of the Blackwood parents, a distinctive ring known to have belonged to Martha, and fragments of clothing matching descriptions of what the sisters typically wore, left little doubt as to their identities. The medical examiner in 1968 could not definitively determine cause of death, but noted fractures consistent with blunt force trauma to all 3 skulls. Whether these injuries were inflicted before death or were the result of the tunnel collapse could not be established with certainty. A particularly haunting detail emerged from the forensic analysis. Traces of earth were found in the lung tissue of all 3 women, suggesting they may have been alive, though perhaps unconscious, when the tunnel was collapsed. This grim possibility was never included in public reports, but appears in the medical examiner's confidential findings, accessed by Palmer through university connections in 1969. On August 3, 1968, nearly 28 years after their disappearance, the remains of Martha, Eleanor, and Ruth Blackwood were interred in Cumberland Cemetery beside their parents. The funeral was attended by few remaining residents who remembered them, several university researchers including Margaret Palmer, and a number of journalists who had followed the reopened case. The official cause of death was amended from missing presumed deceased to homicide by persons unknown, though Sheriff Denton's final report made clear his belief that Joseph Davis, Richard Holt, and Robert Holcomb had conspired in both the murders and subsequent cover-up. No charges could be filed as all primary suspects were deceased. The case was officially closed again on September 17, 1968, exactly 28 years to the day after Eleanor and Ruth made their final trip to Cumberland. The story of the Blackwood sisters might have ended there, becoming another tragic footnote in the complex history of coal country, where corporate interests often trumped human lives. But a final discovery in 1969 added an unexpected dimension to their legacy. While cataloging items recovered from the mine shaft for storage in county archives, researcher Palmer noticed peculiar markings on the inside of Martha Blackwood's silver locket. What initially appeared to be random scratches proved under magnification to be tiny, deliberately etched words. DHS took us, tell Rose. This message raised new questions. No one connected to the case had those initials, and no one named Rose had been identified during the investigation. Palmer's subsequent research into the sisters' connections identified a Rose Campbell who had been their closest neighbor until moving to Ohio in early 1940. Attempts to locate Campbell proved unsuccessful. The meaning of DHS remained unexplained until a former courthouse clerk, responding to newspaper coverage, suggested it might refer not to a person but to the Department of Hill Security, the local nickname for a little-known division of mining police employed by several coal companies in Harlan County during the 1930s and 40s. These private security forces, officially employed to protect mining assets, frequently operated as enforcers against labor organizers and anyone else who opposed company interests. Their activities were rarely documented, and their members' identities were closely guarded. According to local oral histories, they were often recruited from outside the region specifically because they had no ties to the communities they policed. The possible involvement of this shadow organization suggested the conspiracy surrounding the Blackwood sisters might extend beyond the three men identified in Sheriff Denton's investigation. It raised the possibility that their deaths were not merely the result of corporate greed, but perhaps connected to some larger pattern of enforcement against those who resisted the mining company's expansion. During the renewed investigation, Palmer compiled an extensive oral history from elderly residents of Cumberland, focusing on memories of the Blackwood sisters and their place in the community. These interviews revealed dimensions of the sisters' lives and relationships that never appeared in official records. Martha, the eldest, was described as stern but fair, a woman who kept her own counsel and expected others to do the same. She had briefly been engaged to a local man, William Harmon, in the early 1920s, but he died in a mining accident before they could marry. She never pursued another relationship, and instead devoted herself to managing the family business and property. Eleanor, the middle sister, was remembered as the most sociable of the three, often representing the family at community gatherings and handling most interactions with customers and suppliers. Several respondents mentioned her remarkable memory for names, faces, and details, a quality that made her both an excellent businesswoman and a repository of community knowledge. Ruth, the youngest, was described as quiet and scholarly, often seen with books during her infrequent visits to town. She reportedly maintained extensive journals documenting both family recipes and local events. These journals were never found after the sisters' disappearance, though several residents recalled seeing Ruth writing in them regularly. The sisters' moonshine operation was just one aspect of their unusual position in Cumberland society. As unmarried women running a successful business without male oversight, they represented a rare example of female independence in a deeply traditional community. This independence was viewed with both admiration and suspicion, depending on who was asked. According to several accounts, the Blackwood women served as unofficial bankers for some in the community who distrusted formal financial institutions, particularly during and after the banking crises of the Great Depression. They were said to hold valuables, documents, and even cash for neighbors, storing these items securely in their root cellar and returning them when needed. This function as informal record keepers and custodians of community assets would have given them unique knowledge of property boundaries, mineral rights, and ownership histories throughout the area, knowledge that might have proved dangerous as mining companies sought to consolidate their hold on the region's resources. The final chapter of the Blackwood sisters' story came not from official documents, but from the oral testimony of Ida Jenkins, Thomas Jenkins' widow, recorded by Palmer in late 1969. According to Jenkins, her husband had confided in her after discovering the abandoned cabin that he had found something disturbing there that he hadn't included in his report to the sheriff. In the sisters' root cellar, accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, Jenkins discovered dozens of glass jars containing not preserved fruits or vegetables, but documents, deeds, letters, maps, and what appeared to be financial records from numerous families in the region. Martha Blackwood, it seemed, had been serving as an unofficial record keeper for those who distrusted banks and government offices, increasingly influenced by coal interests. Jenkins took one jar containing the deed to his own family's small farm, but left the rest, planning to return. When he reported the missing women to Sheriff Holcomb, he mentioned the documents. According to his widow, Holcomb insisted on accompanying Jenkins back to the property immediately, alone. When they reached the cabin, the root cellar had been emptied completely. It was 2 days later that Jenkins was found dead at the bottom of Sawyer's Ravine, his rifle discharged once. The hunting accident was investigated by none other than Sheriff Holcomb himself. This final revelation suggested that the Blackwood sisters posed a threat beyond their refusal to sell their coal-rich property. As keepers of the community's true records, they held documentation that could have challenged coal company claims throughout the region. Their elimination served a dual purpose, acquiring their land and destroying evidence that might have prevented other acquisitions. The Blackwood case also illuminated the complex network of power that governed life in coal country during that era. The mining companies controlled not just employment, but also housing, retail, healthcare, and law enforcement in many communities. This concentration of influence allowed them to operate with minimal oversight or accountability. Joseph Davis exemplified this concentration of power. As president of both Hollister Mining and Cumberland Bank, and as a county commissioner, he occupied positions that should have involved checks and balances against one another. Instead, they formed a closed system in which decisions benefiting the mining company could be enacted without meaningful opposition. Sheriff Holcomb's involvement demonstrated how law enforcement could be co-opted to serve corporate interests rather than justice. His cursory investigation, followed by his unexplained wealth and relocation, painted a picture of corruption that extended to those sworn to uphold the law. Dr. Donovan's suppressed findings and the subsequent financial benefits he received showed how even professionals with ethical obligations could be influenced or intimidated into silence. His decision to document the truth but conceal it, filing photographs and notes where they wouldn't be found, suggested a man struggling between conscience and self-preservation. What remains perhaps most disturbing about the case is how effectively this system worked. For 28 years, 3 women disappeared without meaningful investigation. Their property was acquired through seemingly legal channels. Those involved prospered without consequence. And had it not been for a graduate student's accidental discovery, their fate might never have come to light. This effectiveness speaks to the vulnerability of isolated communities to exploitation and corruption. Without external oversight or connection to broader systems of justice, Cumberland and similar towns throughout Appalachia were left to the mercy of those who controlled their economic lifelines. The question of how many similar cases might remain undiscovered continues to haunt the region. How many other voluntary departures might have been something far more sinister? How many property transfers occurred under duress or after elimination of the rightful owners? The full extent of such practices may never be known as evidence deteriorates and witnesses pass away. Today, the former Blackwood property sits abandoned. The mine shafts have been more thoroughly sealed, the buildings have long since collapsed, and the forests have reclaimed much of the cleared land. Only foundation stones mark where the cabin once stood. Widow's Creek, once clear enough to drink from, runs orange with mine runoff, despite the decades that have passed since operations ceased. Local attitudes toward the Blackwood case evolved significantly over time. When Palmer first began asking questions in 1967, she encountered resistance and silence from many residents. By 1969, after the sisters' remains had been found and properly buried, more people were willing to share their memories and suspicions. One elderly resident, speaking on condition of anonymity, explained the change. For years, nobody talked about the Blackwood women because we were afraid, but now that the truth's out, there's a kind of release, like we're finally able to honor their memory by speaking it aloud. This sentiment was echoed by others, suggesting that the silence surrounding the case had been as much about community fear as about forgetting. The public acknowledgement of the sisters' fate seemed to break a dam of suppressed knowledge and grief. The University of Kentucky archive holds the collected evidence from the case, including Palmer's dissertation, which documents not just the sisters' fate, but the broader pattern of displacement and destruction that accompanied the coal industry's expansion through the Cumberland region. The dissertation was never published outside academic circles, and Palmer's subsequent work focused on less controversial aspects of Appalachian culture. When interviewed in 1980 about why she didn't pursue publication of her findings more broadly, Palmer cited concerns about potential backlash against her academic career. There are still powerful interests who prefer these stories remain buried, she explained. And the publishing world wasn't particularly interested in exposing corporate malfeasance in remote Appalachian communities. In the decades since, other researchers have attempted to locate the documents supposedly stored in the Blackwood root cellar, hoping some might have escaped destruction. None have been recovered. Whatever secrets they contained, whatever claims to land and legacy they might have preserved, remain buried as thoroughly as the sisters themselves once were. The legal aftermath of the case proved as frustrating as the original investigation. Despite Sheriff Denton's detailed report implicating Davis, Holt, and Holcomb in the sisters' deaths, no posthumous charges could be filed. The statute of limitations on related crimes such as corruption, evidence tampering, and fraud had long since expired. Attempts to secure reparations for the Blackwood estate faced similar obstacles. With no direct descendants to make claims and no evidence of the sisters' final wishes, there was no legal basis for challenging the property transfers that followed their disappearance, regardless of how suspicious the circumstances. In 1972, a small group of Cumberland residents, led by relatives of families who had lost land under similar circumstances, petitioned the state legislature to create a commission investigating historical land seizures by coal companies throughout the region. The petition cited the Blackwood case as primary evidence of systematic abuses. The legislation was introduced but died in committee without a hearing. What we're left with is a story of three women who stood their ground against powerful interests, who preserved knowledge the powerful sought to erase, and who ultimately paid with their lives for their resistance. The official history of Cumberland barely mentions them. No historical marker commemorates their homestead. Their deaths appear in county records with the clinical phrase, homicide by persons unknown, despite substantial evidence identifying those persons. This erasure, this institutional forgetting, is perhaps the final violence done to Martha, Eleanor, and Ruth Blackwood. In a region where family and memory form the backbone of identity, they were nearly written out of both, but some stories refuse to remain buried. Some truths work their way to the surface like the springs that dot the Cumberland hillsides, emerging when and where they will, despite attempts to redirect their flow. The story of the Moonshine sisters, as they've come to be known locally, is one such truth. In 1980, during a community oral history project, elderly residents of Cumberland were asked about significant events from their past. Multiple participants, independently of one another, mentioned what happened to the Blackwood women as a turning point, the moment many realized that standing against the coal companies could be a death sentence. One participant, who requested anonymity even 40 years after the events, summed it up. After the Blackwood women vanished, people stopped fighting. We knew what it meant. If they could take 3 women from their home and make it like they never existed, what chance did the rest of us have? Some sold their land. Others just abandoned it and moved on. Those who stayed learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. The Blackwood case illustrates a pattern of resource extraction and exploitation that has characterized much of Appalachian history. The coal industry brought jobs and economic activity to the region, but often at devastating social and environmental costs. Communities were reshaped or destroyed to accommodate mining operations. Those who benefited most frequently lived elsewhere, while local residents bore the brunt of pollution, dangerous working conditions, and corporate control of civic institutions. This pattern was not unique to Cumberland or to the 1940s. Similar dynamics played out across the coal fields of Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond, from the late 19th century through much of the 20th. The Blackwood sisters' resistance and the violent response it provoked represents just one instance of a much larger conflict over land, resources, and power. What distinguished their case was not the nature of the conflict, but the discovery of its resolution. For most disputed properties in the region, no evidence ever emerged to challenge the official narrative of voluntary sales or abandonment. The truth of how ownership transferred from longtime residents to corporate interests remained buried in unmarked graves or sealed in company records never made public. The legacy of silence surrounding the case extended beyond Cumberland. Despite the sensational nature of the discoveries in 1968-69, the story received little attention outside local newspapers. No books were written, no films produced. Even in academic studies of corporate violence in Appalachia, the Blackwood case is rarely mentioned. This silence speaks to the effectiveness of the original cover-up and to the enduring power of those who benefited from it. The descendants of Joseph Davis continued to hold significant economic and political influence in the region well into the 1980s. Former members of mining security forces transitioned into law enforcement and private industry throughout eastern Kentucky. The structures of power remained largely intact, even as the coal industry itself began its long decline. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwood sisters lies not in official records or academic studies, but in the region's folklore. Stories about the 3 women have evolved over decades, taking on elements of legend while preserving the essential truth of their resistance and fate. Some say that on certain nights, usually around the anniversary of their disappearance, the sounds of glass jars clinking can be heard near the sealed mine entrance, the sisters still protecting the community's records. Others claim that the distinctive aroma of Blackwood moonshine sometimes wafts through the hollows, leading lost travelers safely out of the woods. In one popular variation, the sisters are said to appear as a warning before mining disasters, their spectral form seen near mine entrances the night before a collapse or explosion. This particular legend gained strength after 3 miners reported seeing Women in old-fashioned dress outside the Hollister Upper Foreshaft the evening before a catastrophic failure killed 7 men in 1954, including Richard Holt, who had allegedly led the sisters to their deaths. While such stories contain obvious mythological elements, they serve an important cultural purpose, keeping the memory of the sisters alive in a community that was once forced into silence about their fate. The supernatural aspects provide a safe way to discuss an unsafe truth, that powerful interests once murdered 3 women with impunity and nearly erased them from history. The actual Blackwood recipes for moonshine and herbal remedies were lost with the sisters and the documents from their root cellar. However, several families in the region claim to preserve techniques and formulations passed down from the sisters to their ancestors. Whether these claims have any historical basis is impossible to verify, but they represent another way in which the community has maintained connections to these women who stood against erasure. In 2005, a small memorial was finally placed in Cumberland Cemetery, funded by donations from local residents and coordinated by the Appalachian Studies Department at the University of Kentucky. The simple stone bears the names and dates of the 3 sisters, along with the inscription, "Their story emerged from darkness. May their truth never again be buried." The dedication ceremony was attended primarily by academics, journalists, and a few elderly residents with personal connections to the case. No representatives from mining interests or local government participated, though invitations had been extended. This absence itself spoke volumes about the continuing sensitivity surrounding the case, even 65 years after the sisters' disappearance. The hills of Harlan County still hold many secrets. Some say that on quiet nights, if you stand near where the Blackwood cabin once stood, you can hear the sound of glass jars clinking beneath the earth, the sisters still protecting the documents entrusted to them. Others claim to have seen 3 figures walking along Widow's Creek at dusk, heading toward the sealed mine entrance. These are just stories, of course, the kind told on front porches when the evening cools. But in a place where official history has so often served those in power, sometimes stories are all that remain of the truth. The Blackwood sisters vanished from their home in 1940. For 28 years, their disappearance was a mystery with no investigation, their memory gradually fading from community consciousness. When the truth finally emerged in 1968, it came too late for justice, but not too late for remembrance. Perhaps that remembrance is itself a kind of resistance, an acknowledgement that even the most thoroughly buried truths may eventually find the light. In telling their story, we ensure that Martha, Eleanor, and Ruth Blackwood are not erased from history a second time. And perhaps somewhere, in some family's attic or basement, in a box of papers kept by someone who fled Cumberland in those troubled years, there exists a glass jar with the Blackwood label, containing documents preserved by 3 sisters who knew the value of keeping true records in uncertain times. If such evidence still exists, it remains hidden, much like the full truth about what happened at Widow's Creek on a September night in 1940, when 3 women who refused to be moved disappeared into darkness, and the land they had protected was swallowed by the earth. The case of the Blackwood sisters has taken on new relevance in recent years as debates over resource extraction, corporate accountability, and environmental justice have gained prominence in public discourse. Contemporary conflicts over mining, fracking, and pipeline construction echo many of the same dynamics that characterized the sisters' struggle, communities facing powerful external interests, seeking to exploit local resources, often with the complicity of government officials. The difference today lies in visibility and connection. Modern technologies allow affected communities to document and share their experiences in ways the Blackwood sisters could not. National and international advocacy networks provide support and amplification that was unavailable to isolated Appalachian communities in 1940. Environmental regulations, however imperfectly enforced, create legal frameworks for challenging extractive industries that simply didn't exist when the Hollister Mining Company decided the Blackwood property was worth taking. Yet many of the fundamental power imbalances remain. Corporate interests still wield disproportionate influence in resource-rich regions. Economic vulnerability still limits communities' ability to resist environmentally destructive practices. The short-term benefits of extraction, jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure, still compete with long-term concerns about sustainability and public health. In this context, the Blackwood story serves as both warning and inspiration, a reminder of how easily the powerful can silence opposition when systems of accountability fail, and an example of how truth can persist despite systematic efforts to suppress it. The physical landscape around the former Blackwood property has changed dramatically since 1940. Mining operations continued in the area until the early 1990s, leaving behind altered topography, polluted waterways, and unstable ground. The access road built through the property after the sisters' disappearance has been widened and paved, now serving as a county route connecting Cumberland to neighboring communities. Aerial photographs from 1938 and 2000, compared side by side in Palmer's archives, show the transformation: dense forest giving way to stripped hillsides, then to partially reclaimed land bearing little resemblance to its original contours. Widow's Creek, once clear enough for fishing according to accounts from the 1930s, now runs with the characteristic orange tint of acid mine drainage. The cabin site itself has been reclaimed by nature, with only scattered foundation stones and the collapsed entrance to the root cellar marking where the structure once stood. The spring that provided the sisters with water has dried up, likely due to changes in the water table caused by mining. The outbuilding where they distilled their famous moonshine collapsed sometime in the 1950s, according to local accounts. A 1975 geological survey of the area noted that the coal seam beneath the Blackwood property had been fully extracted, yielding approximately 1.3 million tons of coal valued at roughly $45 million in 1970s dollars. This figure represents the economic value of the resource that made the sisters' land worth killing for. What cannot be so easily quantified as the cultural and human cost of their elimination? The community knowledge lost with them, the documents destroyed, the climate of fear created by their disappearance, and the gradual erosion of local autonomy that followed as more and more residents surrendered their land rather than risk a similar fate. The Blackwood sisters themselves remain enigmatic figures, known more through their absence than their presence in the historical record. The few photographs that survive show three stern-faced women in plain dress, standing before their cabin or seated at community gatherings. Their expressions reveal little of their personalities or the strength they must have possessed to maintain their independence in a society that offered limited roles to women. What we know of them comes primarily from others' recollections, filtered through decades of silence and subsequent mythologizing. They appear in these accounts as symbols as much as individuals, embodiments of resistance, independence, tradition, or whatever other qualities the narrator wishes to emphasize. Perhaps this symbolic quality explains why their story continues to resonate. In the absence of definitive information about who they were, they become vessels for collective memory about what was lost, as Appalachian communities were transformed by industrial extraction and corporate control. The Sisters' Moonshine operation provides a particularly apt metaphor for this transformation. Their small-batch artisanal production, based on traditional knowledge passed through generations and tied to the specific place where they lived, was eliminated to make way for large-scale industrial extraction that fundamentally altered the landscape and severed connections to the past. This pattern repeated throughout the region as diverse, locally rooted economic activities gave way to dependence on a single industry controlled by distant interests. The resulting mono-economy left communities vulnerable to both market fluctuations and corporate leverage, creating conditions where opposing company interests became nearly impossible. The physical evidence of the Blackwood case has largely disappeared over the intervening decades. The photographs and notes discovered by Palmer were transferred to the University of Kentucky archives after the case was closed in 1968. Subsequent budget cuts led to portions of the collection being placed in deep storage, where inadequate climate control reportedly damaged many items beyond recovery. The remains of the sisters, interred in Cumberland Cemetery in 1968, lie beneath a simple marker that gives only their names and dates. No epitaph hints at the extraordinary circumstances of their deaths or rediscovery. Visitors unfamiliar with their story would have no reason to pause at their grave. The mine shaft where they were found has been sealed completely, the entrance destroyed during reclamation work in the early 1990s. Environmental regulations required Hollister's successors to address safety and pollution concerns at abandoned sites, ironically eliminating access to the location of the crime in the name of public welfare. Sheriff Denton's files on the reopened investigation were reportedly destroyed in a courthouse flood in 1972, though some suspect deliberate removal rather than natural disaster. The Cumberland Gazette's coverage of the case exists only on microfilm at the State Library, the original papers having been lost when the newspaper ceased operation in 1980. This gradual disappearance of physical evidence mirrors the initial attempt to erase the sisters from history, a second burial, this time of memory rather than bodies. Yet, despite these losses, their story has persisted, passed through unofficial channels when official ones failed. Academic interest in the case has fluctuated over the years. Following Palmer's initial work, several scholars attempted to incorporate the Blackwood case into broader studies of corporate power and resistance in Appalachia. These efforts faced both methodological challenges, the limited documentary evidence, and political ones, as the region's economic dependence on mining made institutional support for such research difficult to secure. In the 1980s, as labor struggles in the coal fields intensified and environmental concerns gained prominence, the Blackwood story experienced a brief resurgence of interest. Community activists cited the case as an example of the lengths to which coal companies would go to secure resources and suppress opposition. However, this framing often simplified the complex historical context, reducing the sisters to martyrs in contemporary political battles. By the 1990s, the pendulum had swung in the opposite direction. Revisionist accounts questioned the reliability of Abernathy's testimony and Palmer's research methods, suggesting the case had been sensationalized beyond the evidence. Some went so far as to propose that the sisters had indeed left voluntarily and that the remains found in the mine shaft had been misidentified. These revisionist interpretations gained little traction among those familiar with the original evidence, but they created enough academic controversy to further marginalize the case in scholarly discourse. By the early 2000s, the Blackwood sisters were rarely mentioned in mainstream historical accounts of the region. This academic neglect contrasts sharply with the case's enduring presence in local memory and folklore. Throughout the changing scholarly interpretations, residents of Cumberland and surrounding communities maintained their own understanding of what had happened to the Blackwood women and why it mattered. This understanding was preserved not in academic journals, but in stories told at family gatherings, in songs performed at local music events, in the informal archives kept by community historians, and in the cautionary tales passed to younger generations about the dangers of challenging power. In these community accounts, the focus often shifts from the specific details of the sisters' deaths to the broader patterns of exploitation and resistance they exemplified. The Blackwood women are remembered not just as victims, but as defenders of a way of life that valued independence, traditional knowledge, and connection to place, values increasingly threatened by industrialization and corporate control. Their Moonshine operation, illegal but tolerated until it became inconvenient for powerful interests, represents the informal economies that sustained communities when formal ones failed them. Their role as keepers of documents for neighbors who distrusted official institutions reflects the alternative systems of trust and record-keeping that developed in response to corruption and exploitation. In this sense, the sisters embodied what anthropologists call everyday resistance, the small, often unnoticed ways in which marginalized groups maintain autonomy and dignity in the face of overwhelming power disparities. They did not organize protests or form unions. They simply insisted on their right to remain on their land and continue their traditional practices, a stance that proved threatening enough to warrant their elimination. This aspect of their story resonates beyond the specific context of 1940s Appalachia, connecting to broader patterns of resistance by women, indigenous communities, and others facing displacement in the name of progress and development. The methods change, from private security forces to legal maneuvering to economic pressure, but the fundamental conflict between local autonomy and resource extraction continues worldwide. Perhaps this universality explains why interest in the Blackwood case has revived in recent years. As communities from the Amazon to the Arctic face similar pressures from extractive industries, the sisters' story provides both warning and guidance about the stakes of such conflicts and the importance of preserving alternative records when official ones fail. In 2015, a collection of oral histories gathered from elderly residents of Harlan County between 1980 and 2004 was digitized and made available online through the American Folklife Center. Among these recordings were several accounts of the Blackwood case, including interviews with individuals who had known the sisters personally or had connections to the investigation of their disappearance. These first-hand accounts, while varying in details, consistently emphasize themes absent from official records: the sisters' generosity toward neighbors in need, their deep knowledge of local ecology and traditional medicine, their quiet defiance of gender norms, and the community's understanding that their fate was sealed not when they refused to sell their land, but when they began helping others protect theirs. One particularly striking interview comes from Willa Mae Jenkins, daughter-in-law of Thomas Jenkins, who discovered the abandoned cabin. According to her account, recorded in 1982 when she was 84 years old, Martha Blackwood had helped numerous families in the region document their property boundaries and mineral rights during the 1930s, when coal companies began aggressive expansion throughout Harlan County. Martha had a way with documents, Jenkins recalled. She could read those old deeds with their strange measurements from the lightning-struck oak to the bend in the creek and translate them into something that would stand up in court. She helped my father-in-law prove his family had owned their farm since 1842, when the company tried claiming it was unclaimed land. This expertise made Martha particularly dangerous to those seeking to acquire property through questionable means. If she had indeed been collecting and preserving documentation for multiple families, as the jars in the root cellar suggested, her elimination would have served a dual purpose, removing both her own resistance and the evidence that might have supported others. Jenkins' account also sheds light on the social dynamics that allowed such a conspiracy to succeed. Everyone knew what happened, she stated, but knowing isn't the same as proving. And even if you could prove it, who would you tell? The sheriff was in their pocket. The judge was in their pocket. The newspaper wouldn't print what the companies didn't want printed, so people kept quiet, kept their heads down, and remembered in private. This enforced silence extended beyond Cumberland to shape how the region as a whole understood its relationship with the coal industry. Individual tragedies like the Blackwood case were rarely discussed openly, creating an illusion of consent and cooperation that masked the coercion and violence underlying industrial development in Appalachia. Breaking this silence, acknowledging not just the economic benefits of coal extraction but also its human and environmental costs, remains challenging even decades later. Communities dependent on mining for generations develop complex relationships with the industry, recognizing its exploitative practices while also valuing the livelihoods and identities it provides. The Blackwood sisters never had to navigate this complexity. Their opposition to Hollister mining was absolute, their elimination complete. In this, they represent a path not taken, a total rejection of industrial capitalism and its transformation of land from home to resource, of water from sustenance to industrial input, of people from neighbors to labor. Such absolute rejection was possible only from their position as economically independent women with no ties to the mining economy. Most residents of Cumberland couldn't afford such principled stands. Their livelihoods, housing, and community connections were too deeply intertwined with the industry to permit outright opposition. This context helps explain why the sisters' resistance, while admired in retrospect, found few allies at the time. The conditions that enabled their independence, ownership of land, knowledge of traditional practices, viable outside the cash economy, absence of dependence, were increasingly rare as the region industrialized. Most community members faced a stark choice between accommodation and departure. The story of the Moonshine sisters thus stands as both anomaly and archetype, an unusual instance of resistance made possible by exceptional circumstances, yet emblematic of the broader patterns of dispossession and development that transformed Appalachia over the 20th century. Today, visitors to Cumberland find little evidence of either the Blackwood sisters or the industry that claimed their lives. The town itself has dwindled as mining operations ceased, with fewer than 500 residents remaining according to recent census data. The company store where Eleanor and Ruth made their final purchases closed in the 1980s and was later demolished. The courthouse where records of their property were altered has been replaced by a more modern facility. Only the cemetery where they now rest provides tangible connection to their story. Their grave, initially marked with only a simple stone, received a more substantial monument in 2010, funded by a coalition of environmental and historical preservation groups. The new marker includes a brief account of their disappearance and rediscovery, ensuring visitors understand the significance of the site. Each September, a small gathering takes place at the grave, attended primarily by researchers, activists, and a dwindling number of local residents with connections to the case. Jars of moonshine, made according to recipes claiming Blackwood lineage, are sometimes left as offerings along with native herbs and flowers from the surrounding hills. These informal commemorations reflect the sisters' ambiguous legacy, too controversial for official recognition, too significant to forget completely, preserved in the margins of collective memory just as they lived in the margins of their society. Perhaps this marginal status is fitting. The Blackwood sisters operated outside formal economic and social systems, maintaining traditions and knowledge that industrial capitalism sought to replace with standardized alternatives. Their resistance to selling their land represented not just attachment to place, but rejection of the very notion that land could be reduced to commodity. In death as in life, they remain outside the dominant narrative, remembered not through monuments or textbooks, but through stories told on front porches, songs sung at family gatherings, and small rituals of remembrance that connect present to past outside official channels. This unofficial remembrance ensures that while Davis, Holt, and Holcomb may have succeeded in eliminating the Blackwood sisters physically, they failed in their larger aim of erasing them from history. The very silence imposed after their disappearance created conditions for their story to become legend, more powerful in some ways than documented fact would have been. And so, the hills of Harlan County still hold their secrets, but some truths refuse to remain buried. The story of Martha Eleanor and Ruth Blackwood, the Moonshine sisters of Widows Creek, continues to emerge from darkness into light, challenging official narratives and reminding us that resistance takes many forms, some so threatening to power that even memory of them must be suppressed. Perhaps somewhere in an attic or basement, in a box of family papers, kept safe through decades of silence, there still exists a glass jar with the Blackwood label, containing documents preserved by three sisters who understood that keeping true records is itself an act of resistance. If such evidence remains, it waits to be discovered, much like the truth about the sisters themselves waited for 28 years beneath the earth. Until then, their story remains both history and metaphor, a specific tragedy born of specific circumstances and a universal parable about power, resistance, and the long struggle for justice that continues in communities facing extraction and exploitation worldwide. In the quiet hollows of eastern Kentucky, if you listen carefully on certain autumn nights, some say you can still hear the sound of glass jars clinking beneath the earth, the sisters still protecting the community's true records, still bearing witness, still refusing to be erased.